So this is the coupling. An old style vacuum cleaner. Well, it's almost like a fast clean atomic pile. Well, I'm in Point Wells, lovely little community, it's like a village. And there's a river that wraps around it, that goes out to Omaha and the sea. And there's nowhere around here that would be anything like Havana. But occasionally, here you get some like tall trees, palm trees. And it's got a island feel to it. So I'm going to go down to the waterfront, have some kai, and just give some thoughts to camera about the book Our Man in Havana. Excuse me, I'm having a coffee as well. Went to a second-hand store, saw it, and I thought, right, that's a sign, I'll talk about it. What Greene does shows you the seedy side of places, certainly in the books I've read. I think he did The Third Man, which would have been very similar. So he's very evocative, he gives a real good sense of place. So this is where I'm sitting, looking out to the river. Over there is Big Omaha. Interesting book. The film with Alec Guinness gives the impression that he, that is Graham Greene, is writing like a comedic spy caper. It's a guy who sells vacuum cleaners. But it suddenly towards the end takes a dark turn. And I think that's a hallmark of Greene and his writings. The book is very well crafted. It's set in the Cold War, the height of it, and a simple man who just sells vacuum cleaners, needs money, is approached by a British agent and recruited to spy for the British in Havana. He lives there as a resident. And Greene definitely evokes people, their behaviours. Like his other book that I read, you come across some very unusual characters. Hasselbacher, who you don't quite know whether he is a spy or not. Hawthorne, Millie, the daughter. They all have their own motivations. Segura, the police chief. Because we're on the verge of Cuba going into revolution. It's the end of an era. I got that same feeling reading Brighton Rock. Trying to pick up the bird sound, and the one you can hear up here is a tui, also known as the parson bird. I can't see it. The music that I have put to the little ramble around Point Wells is jazz, obviously of the age. But it's also quite melancholy, because the book has a melancholy feel to it. It's like this feeling of ending of an era. Wormold, who is a British expatriate, lives in Havana, and he has a 17-year-old daughter. His wife has left him. We never meet her. But he runs a little shop selling vacuum cleaners, and he's trying to make do. But he's not making that much money. And his daughter wants things, horses and bridles. And dutifully, as a father, he wants to provide them. So he's ripe to make a little bit extra money. So then in comes Hawthorne, who is a British representative. He actually lives in Jamaica. He arrives in Cuba to recruit prospective agents to do some spy work. Cuba, the economy is turning to custard. And effectively what's beginning to happen, there's more and more violence, although that's really just mentioned in the background. You don't really sense it. But the police are round about, and we're on the verge of the Bautista regime falling. It's also in the Cold War era. And on page 9 of the book, Hawthorne, who comes and visits Wormold, the protagonist, says, "We live in an atomic age, Mr. Wormold. Push a button, piff bang." And what's interesting, that the name of one of the vacuum cleaners that Wormold is trying to sell is the atomic pile. So there's this linking of the atomic age and the threat of atomic bombs. That is important. There's various interludes in London, and Wormold has to go to Jamaica at one point. But it's mainly Cuba. It's Cuba during the conflict or the turmoils that's about to bring to power Fidel Castro. Millie says to her father at one point, "Poor father, are we on the edge of ruin?" And he replies, and whenever he replies in the book, because I've seen the film, I can't get out of my head the accent of Alec Guinness, who plays Wormold. And I can't do Alec Guinness. "Oh," he says, "I expect things will pick up again when the disturbances are over." And what Wormold is this almost like slow, rhythmic, methodical man. Quite clever, as it turns out, and quite duplicitous. But he is the centre of the action. Action starts to revolve around him quite slowly, then it picks up pace, and then towards the end there's this like typical Graham Greene, where what has been slightly comedic up until that point suddenly takes a sour note. And it's involving Hasselbacher, who we come across quite early. He's an elderly gentleman, as such, a doctor, and he's German. Now, this is important because I know, speaking to my own family, who are of the younger generation, don't really appreciate how Germany was at the time this is set. So Germany after the war was split in two, Western Germany and Eastern Germany. East Germany was communist. It was literally a puppet state of Soviet Union. West Germany was part of the Western Alliance. And Hasselbacher is often asked, "Are you East or West?" Because if he is West, he's potentially supportive of the Western Allies. But if he was East, then potentially he's a spy. And this is a spy novel. Wormold is expected to recruit agents and spy on behalf of his mother country. But this is not James Bond. This is somebody who has to try and make contacts, who will give little snippets here and there, and he'll feed it back to Hawthorne, who will then feed it back to London. But quickly we find out that as far as Wormold is concerned, he realises that if he recruits agents, he'll be paid to pay them. And he needs money. So he makes up fictitious agents, quite funny. And to keep London a bit more impressed and prepared to pay money, he uses his artistic skills to make out there's something happening out in the Oriente Mountains that they should know about. And what he does, he gives them pictures of his vacuum cleaners. But London believes that they are something to do with like a new military complex or something potentially atomic that's being built that could be a threat to the West. It's quite amusing. But as I said, Cuba is starting to turn for the worst. There's a nice little piece here. This is typical Greene, the way he writes. Page 25. No Havana resident ever went to Sloppy Joe's, this is a nightclub, because it was the rendezvous of tourists. But tourists were sadly reduced nowadays in number, for the president's regime was creaking dangerously towards its end. I'm no expert on Graham Greene. I've only read, in the past, Brighton Rock. But combined with this book, I can say that Graham Greene is very deft at writing or given the sense of place and time, but often from a slightly skewed angle, the angle that most tourists and people who think of a town don't want to know. So it's like brothels, seedy and gin shops and so on. And he's got this wonderful thing on chapter 1 of part 2, where he describes Havana. And bear in mind, Havana is an old Spanish colonial city, and it was becoming quite Western in some of its buildings and shops, but had this seediness to it, this kind of veneer. It was a veneer, really, where the majority of it was quite old and dilapidated. And this is what he said. He talks about Wormold walking home. The long city lay spread along the open Atlantic. Waves broke over the Avenida de Maceo and minted the windscreens of cars. Lovely language. The pink, grey, yellow pillars of what had once been the aristocratic quarter were eroded like rocks. An ancient coat of arms, smudged and featureless, was set over the doorway of a shabby hotel, and the shutters of a nightclub were varnished in bright, crude colours to protect them from the wet and salt of the sea. It was a city to visit, not a city to live in. Beautifully evocative language. What is the thrust of this? And specifically, why was it written? The title gives it away. It's Our Man in Havana. Our Man. It's British. Hawthorne, who's the British recruiting man, is talking to Wormold. And he said, we must have our man in Havana, you know. Submarines need fuel. Dictators drift together. Big ones draw in the little ones. And Hawthorne was played by Noel Coward in the film. It may seem a joke to you, old man, but the main source of the French intelligence at the time of Dreyfus was a charwoman who collected the scraps out of the waste paper baskets at the German embassy. Dreyfus was a French officer who was broken because he was Jewish, and it caused a scandal in France at the time. And Wormold, who's met this gentleman, said, I don't even know your name. Hawthorne. I'm setting up the Caribbean network. It's the Cold War. It's the Allies, led by NATO nations, trying to undermine and beat the ever-increasing technological advance of the Soviets at the time. And it would manifest into a space race. And in fact, a great board game exists about this whole era of the Cold War around the world. It's called Twilight Struggle. Definitely worth playing because it's great for history in its own right. I made a note going through the book about, I call them Greenisms. I don't know if that's even a thing. Graham Greene interjects little snippets into the story that don't really connect to the story, and it may be him putting through some aspects of his own life or truisms of people's lives. So, for instance, page 31, suddenly people are talking, and then they're obviously talking in quotation marks, and then suddenly we get a bit that's got no quotation marks. No one's saying this. It's obviously the author. He says, childhood was the germ of all mistrust. You were cruelly joked upon, and then you cruelly joked. You lost the remembrance of pain through inflicting it. Okay. Schools were said to construct character by chipping off the edges. His edges had been chipped, but the result had not, he thought, been character, only shapelessness, like an exhibit in the Museum of Modern Art. So you get occasionally, like a lot of authors do, they'll interject their opinions into the flow of the narrative that often does go with the narrative, but often doesn't. It's like, okay, the author's making a statement here. Happens a lot. I mean, I've just come across it in Don Quixote, where Cervantes interjects himself into the story, and so on. Page 37. It's really the imagery that he's talking about. They groped their way through the darkness of the Seville Biltmore bar. They were only dimly aware of their fellow guests, who sat crouched in silence and shadow like parachutists gloomily waiting the signal to leap. So he's got this turn of phrase as Graham Greene, really good. So Graham Greene, in the war, was recruited into MI6, the British spy network, by his sister, Elizabeth, who then worked for the agency. And I believe he knew Kim Philby, who basically was a turncoat for Russia. He had to flee to Moscow when it broke. And he was in the intelligence network throughout the war. So he knew about intelligence and espionage and whatever. And I wonder if this is Greene poking fun at the whole ethos of intelligence gathering. Because effectively, what happens is Wormold realises he can make up these pictures, send them to London, and they're duped by it. I mean, they're supposed to be experts. And page 78, 79 goes through quite nicely all about it. So it says, I want photographs. Savage said that one of the drawings reminded him of a giant vacuum cleaner. So they're having this meeting in London, looking at what's been sent them by Wormold, and they can't quite work out whether it's legitimate, it's a real huge base that's being built, but it looks a bit like a vacuum cleaner. The chief said, fiendish, isn't it? The ingenuity, the simplicity, the devilish imagination of the thing. See this one here, 6 times the height of a man, like a gigantic spray. And this, what does this remind you of? And Hawthorne has come back from the Caribbean to London to this meeting. And he stood there and he's a bit, I think the wall has been pulled over our eyes here by Wormold, because he says, a two-way nozzle? There's a two-way nozzle? Well, you sometimes find them with a vacuum cleaner. Vacuum cleaner again, says the chief. Hawthorne, I believe we may be onto something so big that the H-bomb will become a conventional weapon. You know the Russians are said to be working on some idea, something to do with the power of the sun, sea evaporation. And the chief goes on later, I've got a hunch, Hawthorne, that the rebels don't exist. It gives the government all the excuse it needs to shut down a censorship over the area. This is in Cuba. The whole premise is based on the British are so desperate to find out what's happening in Cuba. They're so desperate to keep tabs on the Soviet Union, who, as we know because of the revolution brought Fidel Castro into power, did in fact then open up the island to Soviet military buildup. That was the whole point of the standoff between America and Russia in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And therefore there's some legitimacy involved here. But Greene is really, well, this was way before the Cuban Missile Crisis, is effectively saying they're so intensely focused on finding something, they'll find it even if it doesn't exist. Wormold has duped them just to make a little bit of coin for himself. And it sets off this chain of events that then goes from the comedic to the tragic in the end, because one of the characters, unfortunately, and innocent as it turns out, is dispatched. And it's at that point, towards the end of the movie, the end of the book, it becomes quite serious, although the payoff is not serious as such. There's some really great characters. Beatrice comes in as a secretary for Wormold, and she's really well done, deftly managed. And again, you don't know at the time whether she's sent to keep an eye out on Wormold. Wormold begins to suspect that they are beginning to suspect him, and so on. And it's like, who do you trust? Can you trust yourself? Can you remember half the stuff he's saying? It's caught out occasionally because he has to recruit agents himself that give him the snippets that he collects to hand over to Hawthorne. And they get given these code numbers, 59200 stroke or something. But he forgets that he's put in to Hawthorne that he's got somebody who's like spying in a club. And Hawthorne said, well, can't you speak to him when you're at this club? And he said, who's that? I said, well, you recruited him. It's that kind of stuff. It's Wormold not being able to keep in control of what he's created. A bit like a Billy Liar character. What amazed me, though, and there's a word, I think, I don't know if it's serendipity or synchronicity, maybe. Page 105, as I was reading it, I'd just recorded Two Gentlemen of Verona. The video's up on the channel. And page 105, Wormold is given a book, Lamb's book of Shakespearean plays. So it's all the plays, and an edition done by Lamb. And it's to do where he chooses a page and then starts making a cipher from it. And he said, they found Charles Lamb, the book, at last by Millie's bed because it had gone missing. In fact, she'd taken it innocently, wanting to read Shakespeare, not realising her father's using it as spy work. A leaf turned down showed that she was in the middle of Two Gentlemen of Verona. It's just one of those things, isn't it, that you think, I've just read that. Of all the plays of Shakespeare, the Two Gentlemen of Verona is the most unlikely that you would mention. You could have had Hamlet. You could have had The Merchant of Venice. You could have had Much Ado About Nothing. No Two Gentlemen of Verona. It's considered the weakest of his plays, and there it is mentioned. And it's just like, whoa, okay. Interesting, I was just doing that at the same time. The style of the writing is interesting. It's slow and languid throughout. It builds at pace towards the end. But there's these little scenes that are interjected that like almost farcical, comedic. There's one where Wormold has to go to a house, to a professor. And it's about this conversation that he has trying to help the professor, but ends up making him, his girlfriend who's there, suspect that he's having an affair with somebody else, and it becomes like a comedy of errors. Oh, where's this going? You've also got, as it's slowly revealed, the callousness of the likes of Hawthorne. He's only in it for himself. He doesn't care whether people come and go or die. And it just is a continual jibe at Cold War espionage, which, compared to espionage now, would probably look a bit amateur. And it makes me wonder how many people are like Wormold out there who have been tapped on the shoulder to do something for their country when they're living abroad. The film is very faithful to the book all the way through. They even have this great scene. It's a wonderful scene between Wormold and the police chief where they're playing chess with little bottles of scotch and bourbon, which Wormold has been collecting. And it's mentioned at the very start. And in the movie and the book, they're there. It's really well done. And in fact, what Greene does, he seeds things that come back later. He foreshadows that if this is mentioned, chances are it's going to be needed at the back end of the story or whatever. One is the introduction of a character called Carter on the plane that in the book I think is handled better than the movie. Wormold goes to see Hawthorne in Jamaica. He's told that he's going to have a dinner party or in his honour, but he's going to be poisoned. And Wormold said, what? Blah, blah, blah. And that's the same in the book. Flies back. And in the book and in the movie, he suddenly meets somebody who is also a vacuum cleaner salesman. And you just know there's something about this guy. He's been introduced in such a way he's going to come back later, and he does. But generally, overall, in the book, things that are introduced that will be integral to the plot at the back end of the book are really well done and introduced. So it's like when you're reading anything like this, especially in crime capers and novels, nothing tends to be wasted if it's well written. So in a way, if you know that, as soon as you come across something that's been focused on, you think, oh yeah, I wonder what that's going to be used for later then. Got to remember it. I've come to really appreciate Graham Greene's style and the way he writes things. And of course, it helps knowing that he himself was in this arena. So he's probably talking from experience. Very good book. I do recommend it. So, ta-ta for now.